I can't tell you guys how many times I've just randomly stumbled onto a new television series, fallen down an absolute rabbit hole and binged everything I could watch from it, then sat patiently for the next season only to find out that it's not getting renewed. Unfortunately, there's a good chance that some executive decided to just Thanos snap that series out of existence. But he still wants something more, something new to help scratch that itch. Thankfully, there's always been one more option for a beloved series to continue on with their nerdier fanbase, and that's with the comic book series. Comic book companion series have always been around. They started out back in the day as a cheap tie-in to just squeeze as much money out of the IP, like the Brady Bunch comic that just remade episodes of the show. They're not all bad, and the quality varies depending on how much investment there was from the original creative team, like with Orphan Black, which was similar to the pilot episode, but with more backstory added that would have disrupted the flow of the action. Name almost any single cartoon from the 90s and 2000s, and you're almost guaranteed that they had a comic book tie-in series. Then there are times that the show ends and the creators use the comics to finally tell the stories that they never got to tell on the small screen. They range from giving us a few more adventures like Gravity Falls, or they finally give the characters the send-off they deserve. Firefly was the perfect example of this. 14 fantastic episodes in 2002, one conclusive ending with the film Serenity in 2005, and Dark Horse Comics continued the story from there before passing the baton to Boom Studios in 2018, and the series lives on to this day. This is actually fairly common with comic tie-ins, like, there are probably a handful of Brickleberry fans who were excited that it got a 4-issue run after it was canceled, just, the show wasn't my thing, but I'm happy for you if you were. And then there are many TV series that first were adapted from comics and then later went back to being a comic, like Smallville, Paper Girls, and Riverdale. What I'm more interested in is the shows that ended abruptly, continued on as a comic book, and then through the continued fan interest in the story, it changed the minds of the network and we finally got to see that show come back in one form or another. Here are 8 comic series that gave a beloved TV show their second wind. Number 8. Futurama. Futurama was a sci-fi comedy about a regular guy from the year 1999 being sent far into the year 3000. Created by Simpsons' Matt Groening, this show was one of the smartest shows on television, in part due to the number of writers on the show who had degrees from Harvard. In my opinion, no television series finale can ever match the final episode of Futurama. It gave an emotional conclusion to Fry and Leela's romance, and had enough nods to each and every character to give them a proper farewell. I mean, it only took them 4 tries to finish the show and nail the perfect ending, but hey, now they're coming back on Hulu on July 24th, 2023. So it could be the perfect example of what I'm talking about. When Futurama first aired in 1999, it had a companion comic book series by Bongo Comics. It continued production even during the first hiatus after being dropped from Fox, during the 4-movie run that technically made up Season 5, and long after the Comedy Central revival, which ended in 2013. They even made it all the way up to the point where they were riffing on Pokemon Go. There's no doubt in my mind that the series would have been revived in 2023 regardless, but that first direct-to-DVD revival could not have been possible without the support of fans after the San Diego Comic-Con live read of the comic books, with the cast reprising their role. Number 7. Twilight Zone. The original series of The Twilight Zone, narrated by Rod Serling, will go down in history as one of the most influential horror and sci-fi series to ever grace our screens. It was horror, but it was never brutal. It was fantastical, but it never stopped being thought-provoking. Nearly every episode of the original run created a new star within its self-contained anthology. Like William Shatner worked with the legendary Richard Donner in both of their career-establishing episode that was about a gremlin on an airplane. Dell Comics ran 4 issues in 1961. The comics themselves kept the short story anthology tone of the show. As the series later shuffled into the Golden Key imprint, it could be less restrictive, showing graphic content. The Comic Code Authority was strict, but broadcast television was stricter, and Serling took advantage of that freedom. After the unfortunate disaster that happened with the creation of the Twilight Zone movie, the 1985 revival of the series would pivot to be more in line with Serling's original vision of the show and use the comics as basis. And just as the shows made the careers of everyone involved, so too did the comics give us the start of Len Wein, co-creator of Swamp Thing, Wolverine, and Giant Size X-Men, Walt Simonson, a longtime Thor writer and artist, Frank Miller, the creator of Dark Knight, 300, and Sin City, and Alex Toth, the creator of Space Ghost and a longtime collaborator with Hanna-Barbera. Number 6. Space Ghost Coast to Coast. Speaking of Space Ghost, this show also had a very weird history of reboots. First, it was a cartoon show in the 60s under Hanna-Barbera by Alex Toth. It was a quick cash-in on the superhero craze, but it just didn't click. Then he was brought back in the 80s as a member of Space Stars, but only lasted another 20 episodes. Then in '93, the show was drastically reimagined as a surreal parody of late-night talk shows. It repurposed old animation cells and redubbed everything to include live-action celebrities who were entirely out of the loop on what they just signed up for. I know the phrase ahead of its time gets tossed around a bit, but this show truly was one of the few series on Cartoon Network that was created with an adult audience in mind, but after its cancellation, DC picked up the series and continued the story as part of the Cartoon Network starring line. It was about the inner workings of a TV studio while also keeping the supervillains hostage with the bombs in their brains. The comic also brought in Brack, another supervillain from the original cartoon run, to Coast. And when Adult Swim launched in 2001, Space Ghost would pick up exactly where the comic left off. Number 5. Samurai Jack. Samurai Jack was the magnum opus of the creator of many Cartoon Network gems, Genndy Tartakovsky. It was about a time-displaced feudal Japanese samurai who was on a never-ending hunt for the demon lord Aku, who now rules the world in the future. The show only lasted 4 seasons and never really got a proper ending, with Jack just accepting that he's now stuck in the future. The IDW comic run picks up right after season 4. It still followed the tried-and-true formula of Jack getting close to stopping Aku, but not close enough. He has adventures with other characters he helped along the way from the show, fights even more robots, and then finally grows a sick beard before he gets ready for one last assault. The series felt a lot more adult in theme and tone. Then 2 years after the comic ended, the show got revived on Adult Swim with that same feeling from the comics, even down to that glorious beard. Number 4. The X-Files. It's hard to describe how massively successful of a show The X-Files was when it aired in the 90s. It followed Special Agent Dana Scully, a no-nonsense scientist and FBI agent, and her partner, Special Agent Fox Mulder, an eccentric conspiracy theorist, as they hunted down the Monster of the Week, the perfect formula for comic book serialization. Which is odd that the series had a comic book run that was just a recreation of the show. Then the franchise lay dormant until it had a quick 30 Days of Night crossover. It wasn't until IDW got the publishing rights and literally made 2 runs called X-Files Season 10 and Season 11. The success of the comic sparked enough interest to actually do those 2 seasons, even though the plots are only slightly related. Like, they both involved the cigarette-smoking man being still alive, which, I mean, he was the series antagonist, of course he's coming back, along with Mulder and Scully's son, William, who was the most obvious dangling plot thread. But the comics did have fun with the post-WikiLeaks conspiracy theories, and thankfully, they never dipped their toes into the actual malicious ones. Birds aren't real. Number 3. Invader Zim. The show is a very dark kids comedy about an alien, Zim, trying to take over the world. Invader Zim was definitely one of those shows that had to reach that far surpass its actual episode count. It only had one 20-episode season in 2002, a Christmas special that ended with Santa taking over the world, and a remaining 6 episodes that were released with the DVD box set. Which is odd considering the ridiculous amount of merchandise that filled Hot Topic, and how liking this show was some people's entire personality for a decade. The series creator Jonan Vasquez had continued to work on the series under Oni Press after he was told by fans how much they missed the show, but he never really stopped coming up with ideas in his head. Which is perfect because Vasquez himself got a start in the comic book world with Johnny the Homicidal Maniac and Squee before getting into animation. Invader Zim would finally get a finale film on Netflix in 2017, and they even promoted Jenny Goldberg, who worked on the comic, to art director of the film. Number 2. Avatar: The Last Airbender. The show followed Aang, a child who was destined to become the master of all of the elements, but had to carry this burden of having to save the world while still being a literal child. It never talked down to the audience, and it really showed love for each of the characters in the story, and when the world needed this show the most, it vanished. Well, not exactly. It ended the story with a nice bow, but this world was far too interesting to let it be forgotten. The original creators, Michael Dante DiMartino and Brian Konietzko, both worked to make the comic The Lost Adventures, to fill in some of the gaps between the episodes, but they later started working on telling the stories of what would happen to Team Avatar after the events of the series. Since there was still so much more room to take this world, they revived the series with Legend of Korra, a sequel that followed the reincarnation of Aang. The show would also bring in many of the older characters back, and it's actually very heartwarming to see that all of the events of the comic books were entirely canon to the events of the sequel series. Number 1. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. There was something special about the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. It took stock footage from a Japanese television show called Super Sentai, and it spliced in scenes with American actors to create an entirely different show, which is super easy to do since all the fight scenes had everyone wearing masks anyways. The actual story was about 5 American teenagers banding together to fight off evil aliens. Then the new kid, Tommy, shows up, joins the villains, becomes a complete badass, kicks everyone's asses, and then kicks the villains' asses too. This show had no right being as good as it was for only having a budget that was basically $10 in a dream. This show has gone through 21 different themed series, and still nothing comes close to the success of the original Mighty Morphin series. Even a theatrical reboot wasn't enough to spark interest in the Power Rangers again. That is, until Boom Studios got the right to start creating their own Power Ranger comics, and either continued the story or gave a much darker alternate take. Like in Ranger Slayer, the Pink Ranger, Kimberly, goes to an alternate dystopian world where she kills her way to the top and rules over the armies of both the good and evil. It was stories like these that got fans interested in a 30-year anniversary special on Netflix. It even follows the same continuity of the continuation comics. Not the dystopian murder world, but I'd watch the hell out of that one too. And that's my list. I know there's many more continuation comic books out there that helps bring back the original series, but I want to hear from you guys. What's that one show that you want to see make the jump from TV to comics to back to TV again? And if you liked today's video, please hit that like button and subscribe for more weekly content on comic books and nerd stuff. I've been Eric, and you've been awesome.